How you feeling, Dom?
That's a loaded question, Jenna.
Well, I mean, it's been, we've had some time. Last week's episode, I think, was pretty heavy. As we, talked about how journalism, political journalism, I think the job that was done covering the well, obviously this election campaign and looking forward. So that was a lot.
Yeah, I still have a lot of feelings about that, but
Well, I think everybody still has a lot of feelings. I
I
mean,
know.
the reports that are coming out is that people from within the Beltway have a lot of feelings on both sides of the aisle about stuff that's happening. So, yeah, no. I think being a journalist in 2025 is going to be a very, very precarious, unfortunately, but I, very interesting. I hope success for so many people, but I fear a lot of precariousness.
It goes back to how do you get paid? You know what I mean? Like how do you make money?
Mm.
How do you make money off in this industry when it seems to still be all burning up? But
Well, speaking of making money, it sounds like our headlines have some suggestions that people have come up with. So let's start the show. Hi, I'm Jenna,
And I'm Dom, and we're both award winning journalists.
who've recently been laid off.
Our industry is experiencing a seismic shift, and it's shed a lot of really good journalists.
So, where does that leave us? Well, we're definitely laid off.
And we're looking for new jobs, looking for what's left of the industry, and what to do next.
And we're looking at all of it. So, if you're a fellow laid off journalist, a working journalist, or someone who admires the craft, we're looking to build community.
Develop new skills, and try to figure out what just happened.
Welcome to Laid Off and Looking.
so, Jenna, let's start off with
Yeah.
our first headline this week, and that's about the shakeup at the LA Times. Billionaire owner Dr. Patrick Soon-Shiong announced this week that he plans to hire conservative and centrist voices for the paper's editorial board to create a more fair and balanced opinion section.
Hold on, wait a second.
Um,
Isn't fair and balanced copyrighted? I'm kidding. I just I associate that with a different
it's a
network.
yes, which is a former. I don't even think they use that anymore. They stopped using it a while ago.
Oh, they
Um,
just gave up the ghost. Okay.
I think though, yeah, I think so. Basically, the announcement follows the controversy move that remember we've been talking about over the past couple of weeks, which was how uh, Dr. Sun Young had basically blocked the old editorial board's endorsement of Kamala Harris for president. He kind of came clean and said this time that part of the reason why he did block it was because of her stance on Gaza.
Mm,
Um, so basically, that after that happened, it led to resignations, staff protests, people canceling their subscriptions.
worst thing you could do
So
to a paper.
yeah, and it kind of leaves the LA Times right now at this point where they're trying to figure out how to rebuild reader trust. So that's kind of where we're at right now with that.
With no trust.
Um,
All right, let's
with
move
no
forward.
trust. Well, no, but it's like you think about it. So I was looking up. So mind you, this some of the information in here is based off of a CNN article because they actually
Mm,
interviewed uh, the good doctor this on Tuesday this week, and basically he this is a direct quote from him, and it says somebody just picking up the paper, Gen Z today, or something. I don't know, would recognize that this is an opinion. This conflation of news and opinion of the news sometimes gets all mixed up. And I think that's part of the problem of why there's a reduction in trust of the press. So, honestly, kind of saying what
we've been
you
saying.
we've had this discussion with so many people that there is a confusion, a lack of media literacy
Correct.
in terms of what is opinion. My question for you, Jenna, is though, do you think by I don't know. I mean, I'm trying to be open to this idea. I do think it's good to always have a diversity of voices on your
Hmm.
board, especially you're talking about. But my concern is there ever going to be a way to give a fully balanced look to it? Like people can still, even when you have all the different voices, people can still say, well, because I disagree with what you're saying.
Oh, well, first of all,
I'm just
people can poke holes in anything. I mean, I feel like human species are professional hole pokers, for God's sake. Like,
mhm.
there's no way you could speak to a group of people and they're, okay, let me try this again. No group of people, no matter how big the group or how small the group is uniform in thought. Everybody's got diversity of thought. People break down along different lines, and the more diverse the group is, the more diversity in thought you're going to get. So no, you're never going to be able to please everybody. But I think that I do agree with, the lack of media literacy is changing the trust in institutions. I mean, that and a few other issues. But
Yes.
no, that I agree with him on that one. That's a very real issue and a real problem.
But I do sometimes wonder, well, hearing this, it's like, will it change if you're even super transparent? Like I saw here another comment that he made is, I think endorsements should be based on factual analysis and really transparent exposure, or the basis of the endorsement rather than basically what I said before, groupthink. So I,
Wait a
I
second.
guess,
Most of the endorsements I've read, the whole endorsement is the basis of the endorsement. Like it's a whole explanation for why we're endorsing this person.
I guess that's what I'm going with. It's like, my concern is where
That's literally what
facts
it is, sir.
start facts start becoming when you don't agree with the fact that
Yeah,
is a fact, that all of a sudden you start to question and say,
the
well, I
validity
don't
of the
believe you
fact.
then.
Yeah.
Well, you don't believe it then. It's like if you don't vote the way I vote, or if you don't endorse the person I endorse, therefore I will not agree with you. So then it becomes, all right, then don't do endorsements. Which is a conversation to be had, as we've said before. But
I know, but I think we have to be able to not like a fact, but not invalidate it. Like,
mhm.
I don't like the fact that it's been ridiculously dry in the Northeast, so much so that there's wildfires popping up all over the place. I don't like that fact, but it doesn't make it any less true.
Mhm. Agree. I'm very curious what this means. I think obviously having diverse voices is important, but I don't know if that's really what's going to solve that situation. I don't know if anybody knows at this point what will
No,
solve the trust issue with media.
no,
Uh,
but
okay.
still. Yeah, well, it's kind of interesting that you said that the article that you were basing this information on was from CNN. Because I heard that CNN and Reuters were considering
Okay.
a little paywall, maybe a little pay us if you want to see our stories, which is kind of ironic because didn't CNN have a big drop in ratings? I don't know, maybe people don't want to watch the stories, but they might still want to read the stories online.
Well,
But if stuff
they're
is behind a paywall,
they are the most popular site website in the US with 441 million unique views, and that was in August of
oh,
2024. So
okay.
they are yeah,
So people
they're
just don't want to
I,
watch them anymore. They still want to read them.
well, people might not want to watch the content on, on broadcast or on
Yeah.
cable, so but they're willing to read the articles and go online and watch. I don't know what their content's like on
Or watch
YouTube or on their
videos. Yeah.
videos. Yeah, I don't know what it's like on their website, unique views on their website, but they certainly, they've been doing this for so long. But yeah, I'm really curious, to see how this works out for them. Uh, I guess it's going to be a slow burn right now. They're going to start off with like what a lot of websites do, where it's like, oh, you have a limited number of free articles that you can get from them,
Hmm.
and then after a certain point, they'll start charging you, right?
Hmm.
And then afterwards, yeah, I guess we'll just see how it plays out. Because I always wonder if every people are paying for everything. Like people don't want to pay. I mean, we've seen this happen over and over again. People don't want to pay for content. They
No.
just, you know, they occasionally will when they're forced to, but I do wonder
And
this is
after
a,
they're hooked on something.
and after they're hooked on something,
Yeah.
true. Do you see yourself, do you pay for a lot of content, in terms of like especially like
News
news
content?
media.
Okay, so here's the thing. I do subscribe to my local newspapers, mostly because local news needs to live, for God's sake. So I do subscribe there. However, um, yeah, like I mean, I don't have subscriptions to the big papers, but also I have an excuse, okay? I'm unemployed, technically. So
That's my thing.
that's my excuse.
I was doing more of that before
But
knowing.
yeah, so I mean, I I don't know. I mean, maybe people will do it. And I guess it also depends on how they ratchet it up. You know what I mean? Like you can't immediately put everything behind a paywall. It's got to be like, some
Hmm.
stuff is behind a paywall, some stuff isn't. And then, maybe a little bit more stuff goes behind it and more stuff. So it's one big frog boiling in the pot scenario for like everything.
Do you think though it's when we talk about, you know, is news for everybody? Like
Mm,
once you start charging,
hmm
does it become problematic then all of a sudden news is only for people who are willing to like those
It
people who have make a certain
de-democratizes it. Is that a word? De-democratize? Because that's basically what
let's say
happens.
this. Let's just say yes,
We'll
it
say it
does.
is, yeah.
It is, yeah.
But no, it seriously, it de-democratizes the news and allows for, because again, people who can't afford to, or for whatever reason, aren't paying for uh
Hmm.
to get past the paywall,
Hmm.
they're still going to get information to the questions that they ask, but they're going to get it from somebody else who's giving it away for free.
Hmm.
And do we know if those are good actors, bad actors? Again, in my opinion, I don't think there's ever been a time in the history of ever where there's been a vacuum of any kind, either power or thought, and something that wasn't nefarious didn't slither into that. So I honestly, I do not know what that means for the health of the information ecosystem.
I know there's like I totally get that, you know, having a certain amount of free news content out there is, and you know, you are still giving some of it. Yeah, it's still out there for people to, I guess, read it. And but at the same point, when you talk about that, that's the whole thing for me is the fact that if somebody is, you know, doesn't have the whatever $10 a month, five, $4, five, you and I know I think CNN's charging $4 a month, and I believe Reuters is charging $1 a week. You know, somebody could look and say, well, come on, that's so yeah, that might
That's
not be a lot
$52 a
cheap.
year.
And for people who are at a time when, you know, it's difficult for people to pay their own, you know, just paying your bills.
Yeah, no.
Yes. You know what I mean? Like, I think that's the concern. And I get that, you know, they have to look at ways of making money themselves. I just wonder where that leads us. You know, I have no idea. You know what I mean? It's
I'm
just like,
wondering also what's the driver behind this because we all know at this point that there's a lot of people who do news content who rely on being able to have access to those articles for their news content. Like the person sitting there in the green screen of the article in the background, et cetera. Like that's common at this point. I wonder if it's just a reaction to that because those creators then are able to build a platform and then, of course,
sure.
monetize off of another organization and, more importantly, another reporter's work.
But you know, if you're but for them then to be able to pay that money, that's going to be fine. Like for them, they'll be fine if you're a content creator, if you're a TikTok, you know, news reader
Hmm
who takes other, let's say, uses CNN's articles to just read their articles, and I don't want to say pass it off as your own, but I think you know what I mean. Like it's like
No,
if
I
that's
don't
all
think
you're
any of
doing,
those creators have ever passed that work off as their own. They're just able to build a platform using someone else's work. That's all.
right? But at the same point, you know, I don't know. They're going to be still, I guess, you know, CNN can look at it and be like, well, at least if people are using it, we're going to be charging that. I mean, at least you're paying for it. But I go back to the everyday person who's not doing that, who
Yeah.
is hungry for news. They kind of
Yes,
get
and that's the
penalized in this
thing
whole
that like I
process.
think sometimes people when the public, they don't know and they don't want to know. Actually, no, people are really, really hungry for information. It's just where they're going to get it is where the problems start to come in.
It's kind of a place where I think public media, a place that we both know very well about. But I mean, they really have always kept that kind of model of news is for everyone.
Yeah.
But I mean, do you even
How
see
long
something like
before
that
they end up
changing?
putting stuff before behind a paywall? I don't know because I mean it's the whole mission of being a nonprofit would be my guess. That was always my understanding. Um, but I don't know. I mean, listen, market forces, free market forces demand what they demand.
Yeah. Well, those are the headlines for the week, Jenna.
All right. Well, anyway, speaking of paying for news, that leads directly into our our next interview. So stay tuned. Most people who found themselves in the dreaded layoff meeting received an explanation that went something like this: this has nothing to do with you. We think you're great. Yada, yada, yada. The budget. Now, different businesses have different stressors leading management to make these incredibly difficult decisions. But for those of us who've toiled passionately away in broadcasting, well, turns out there never really was a plan to shore up the business side of things. Yeah, that's great. Julia Barton is an executive editor, writer, producer, and reporter who has worked with industry powerhouses like PRX's The World, NPR member station WHYY out of Philadelphia, and Pushkin Industries. And she recently completed a fellowship at the Nieman Journalism Lab at Harvard, where she explored this very topic. We'd like to welcome Julia to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Thank you for joining us. So, first of all, quite the resume that you've got. And I'm sure I didn't even begin to scratch the surface, but you've taken a unique approach into your research into broadcasting and podcasting. So, how would you describe your work and what drew you to it?
Well, I applied for this Nieman Fellowship in the hopes of better understanding my own business. I've been in the world of public radio and podcasting at this point 30 years, and I never kind of understood why things were done the way they were done, or kind of like where these habits of broadcasting and standards of broadcasting and the way, we all kill ourselves to do certain things. I never really understood kind of the origin story of all of that. It was very folkloric, just kind of like, this is the way we do things. Here's how you do it. And then you get so caught up in doing it that you just do it. But now, as an editor, I'm in the position of having to explain to other people who come from outside this world, people like writers, nonfiction authors, academics who want to make podcasts. I'm editing their scripts with them, and they're like, "Why? Why do you say this?" And I'm like, "Cause that's how it's done." And they're like not buying it. So,
No,
so
that's
I was
so
like,
true.
yeah. Yeah, it's really shoddy not to know the origin story of your own business, but you get so caught up with deadlines that, really wanted a chance to take a step out. And I'd kind of done it through stories, I'd like done a story for 99% Invisible more than 10 years ago called The Broadcast Clock, which was about, the sort of clock with all the segments in it that we have to follow in a live news magazine like All Things Considered, or this show that I edited called Weekend America. There are these hard time posts, and it's really difficult to assemble live, even if you have these pre-recorded elements, because it's down to the second. And it takes a level of discipline and coordination and hierarchy that really, it controls the rest of the business. It's much more important that you bring in a piece to the exact time, or the editor cuts it down to the exact time that's needed, than it is what the piece says. So my question in 2013 with Roman Mars was like, okay, here's this clock that many listeners are not aware even has the power that it does, because public radio tries to hide its presence. But what happens to our medium of audio when we don't even have to worry about a clock? And that was at the beginning of sort of podcasting becoming a popular medium. So that was fun, and I was fascinated by it, but I still didn't know the origin story of the actual broadcast clock itself. It was just a thing that I wanted to explain. So on this fellowship, I was able to finally have some time to go back and read scholarship about the history of broadcasting and start to understand all of that. And I loved it. Like, I just want to do that for the rest of my life, like, if I can, because I'm a big nerd.
I feel like most people who listen to podcasts have that same type of feeling of being like,
Hmm.
because you have to. It's a medium that kind of you have to like listen, you use your imagination, you're listening to stories. It's not so well, I don't feel like it's gotten more popular, but still the people who followed it from the beginning, like it really is very niche. So, but Julia, let's go to the article that you wrote. That was the in 1924, the magazine contest, who's to pay for broadcasting and how. Um, it seems like a question that still is relevant to what we're dealing with today. Um,
Hmm.
how, explain a little bit about the contest and also how has this still not been, how we still are dealing with the same issue today.
Yeah, so that was a piece of something that I would run across stuff in reading these books about the early days of radio, and I'd be like, wait, that is still a problem. It's actually more of a problem now with podcasting. Certain patterns were repeating themselves, and it was much more evident given the business cycle of the last decade or so with podcasting, the commercial podcasting, especially that I've been a part of. And so that was just one piece of it, but because there was like 100-year anniversary, it was like a good hook. So I pitched it to one of the publications of the Nieman Foundation where I was doing my fellowship, Nieman Lab, because they have readership in in the journalism world, and I was like, isn't it ironic that there was this contest 100 years ago? And they were like, yeah, that's weird. So the contest itself was part of this wider conversation that was going on in the very earliest days of radio in the United States. So radio had been basically a military and a nautical technology up to that point. It was the most exciting opportunity in that scientific realm of radio waves was to send Morse code via radio waves between ships or between ships and the shore, because more and more people were taking boats around the world, and shipping stuff around the world. And once you were on a boat, you were basically cut off from the rest of society, for however long it took you to get to your destination. So, there were ways that, you can read Moby Dick and read about like all the signals between ships and things like that, but they had to just sort of happen upon each other, and see each other. And it was also hard for ships to precisely locate themselves. So radio was like this technology that was gonna, save the world of shipping. But then people figured out during World War One, when the Navy had control of radio, they kind of made all the patent holders cooperate technologically, and it kind of supercharged the research in the medium. And people had kind of figured out how to use imprint voices and music on the radio waves, not just Morse code. And so once, the war ended and it went back to private hands, people were really excited about this, talking through the ether. They call it the ether. So that was like a miracle, like to be able to just, have this device and hear voices from all over the place, or
Mhm.
hear music just coming into your ears, was like nothing had ever existed like that in humankind. You couldn't see where the voices were coming from, but you felt like they were talking to you, and it was this amazing thing. So, the next thing was people wanted licenses to broadcast, and there was this rush of people applying to the government, the federal government, Department of Commerce, to get a license to like broadcast their church service, to broadcast their, farm reports, to just play music and just entertain people. Very little of it was about the news, but there was some of that too. Like people wanted to, broadcast election results or whatever. So there was like a rush to do that. And the the big companies that had like built the technology, they were like, well, what's our profit going to be? And it was in selling the actual devices, the receivers to get radio. But even right away, they were like, wait a minute, what happens once everyone has a radio? We sold all the radios we're going to sell, basically. How is this going to get paid for? Because we're doing this for free. And it's not like a newspaper where, you pay to get it. It's not like a theater show where you pay for a ticket. It's even a telegram you pay for by the word. You pay for telephone calls by the minute. How are people going to pay for radio? And it was a real concern. Like, they were not broke. they were making a ton of money off of just selling hardware, the radios. But that's what's fascinating to me reading this stuff is like they're really afraid of like what's next business wise. And so the professional magazine of the industry was sort of like, I think of it as the Wired magazine of its day. It was called Radio Broadcasting. They were like, well, we're going to figure this out once and for all. We're going to, put it out to, we're going to crowdsource an answer. So they decided to have this contest, and they announced it in summer of 1924. And the prize was going to be $500, which is like a lot of money. It's almost $9,000 now in our dollars. So like, they really wanted good ideas, and they wanted people to be motivated a lot of people to be motivated to send in ideas. So they got like thousands of entries. And, this whole contest was mentioned in books I was reading, written about broadcasting history, but I could go back and actually find the original, issues of Radio Broadcast magazine, which, by the way, is mostly advertisements for gear. It's the same as like reading a computer magazine from, the 1990s. It's hilarious. It's all about the latest gear, which now looks like really antiquated. So
I'm sure people will say that about our iPhones at one point.
Yeah, I know. They're like, what is this ridiculous? Like, why are people so caught up in these gigantic iPhones? Anyway, so long story short, they got a bunch of entries. They picked a winner. And then what to me was fascinating and also tragic is the winning idea was pretty good. It was to tax at just like a single tax on each vacuum tube in your radio receiver. So that was a cutting edge technology at the time. If you wanted to receive and be able to tune to a bunch of different frequencies and get like good reception, you needed vacuum tubes. And the more vacuum tubes you had in your radio, the better reception you would get. So the idea was $2 tax per vacuum tube in your radio. And then that would go to a central fund, and then the federal government would administer that and then distribute that money back to the station so that they could pay for programming or whatever, pay for better transmitters. And I was like, that's not a bad idea. It's not that regressive, it's kind of a usage tax. And the winner, who seemed like he's very young, there's a picture of him in the article. He's just like, we pay for phone calls, we pay for theater tickets. This is, pay for the amount of stuff that you get. Pay, each user should, and then, maybe there's like amateurs who have to build their own radios, which you could do, and they wouldn't be taxed much or at all. So there was still a way to get radio without paying the tax. So it seemed equitable. And then the tragic part is, so he proposed this and everyone was like, that's the winner. And then they were like, and by the way, we don't think this is such a great idea. It was just the best one we got. And we're going to devote the next issue to why it will never work. So then you go to the next issue, and it's like they're all trashing him. And these are very powerful people punching down on this poor kid's idea who's won the contest. And their reasoning was, the tax is onerous. The people will rebel. They won't like it. The federal government should have no business in radio, which actually, they were like worried about censorship. And during World War I, there was a lot of censorship of the media. Like the post office was actually seizing publications that criticized the war effort. So I can kind of give them some credit for that. It wasn't just like libertarian ranting. It was like, this actually happened recently and we didn't like it. And we don't want to go back to that. So, okay. But there were like a lot of other reasons they were like, just like, this is bad. But they were also saying you can't advertise, you can't use the airwaves for advertising. It's a public trust. And that's different from now.
That's very different from now.
Yeah.
Well,
that's really different. But then they had no other ideas. They were like, let's just see what happens. And I was like, no, dudes, don't do that. Like, that's magical thinking. And that's where I got mad at them.
No, that's completely okay. So a few things just so that like people grasp. So first of all, the kid's name was H.D. Kellogg Jr. of Hartford, Pennsylvania. Is that a coincidence name? Oh, Haverford, Pennsylvania. Excuse me to anybody in Pennsylvania. But was that a coincidence name, or was that like Kellogg as a, because it's spelled the same way pretty much? I
know. I don't know if he's related. Like the editors at Nieman Lab were like, what happened to him? Like, and I couldn't find any much more about him. Maybe because he was using his initials. I don't know if
Okay.
he was with the Kellogg family.
I
But he
just wonder
kind of
how many other
disappeared.
Kellogg's are there.
Yeah, he disappeared from the internet in 1924 after this. But also, I don't blame him because, like, who wants to continue your public career when you win a prize and in the next month, the Secretary of Commerce and the head of the National Association of Broadcasters are all trashing your idea, and everybody's like, no, it'll never happen.
Well,
What
yeah,
a
like you
horrible
win a prize
whiplashing.
that you guys asked for advice. I gave you an idea, and then you like publicly shame me.
Oh,
Yeah.
oh, and they chose you
And
as the
then,
winner, and then they publicly shame you.
yeah, and it was very competitive. And like the other ideas were like, let's print all the listings for all the things on the radio, and then we'll sell that to subscribers. And they also proposed pledge drives, basically like a month long fundraising effort.
No.
And then the most pathetic ones were like, some rich person will be persuaded to, pay for it. And
I mean, even going back over
so
this
bad.
conversation, the seriously century-long lack of imagination.
Yeah.
I do want
Yeah.
to quote the piece though, because
Okay.
in touching on this, you did say that after, this poor Kellogg kid just got raked over the coals for his otherwise pretty decent sounding idea. You wrote, but rather than try to figure out a smarter way to fund public-minded, high-quality broadcasting, the men behind the radio broadcast contest decided the real winner should be nada, nothing. Quote, for the present, I think it's better to let things ride as they are, wrote columnist Ze Brook, I guess. Anyway, he wrote that in May of 1925. Just out of curiosity, what would you say is that dude's legacy then?
I mean, he was a columnist and he was an industry guy, right? And a lot of the people at the time, I think it mirrors the internet in many ways, the rise of the internet. They were concerned with hardware and technology and how to make reception better. And that was considered, the public service. Like, this is a new thing. It should reach more people in a higher quality way. And they were really concerned about static. And so his preoccupations were elsewhere. And I don't know much about the guy, but like most of the columns I read were more by him were more about the industry. So this was a failure of imagination on his part and many other people's part. I mean, I have to give them credit for at least
Oh my
trying to
God.
hold a conversation. But clearly, like, nobody really wanted to fix the problem because there were other models, which would come up constantly in these conversations. In Great Britain, the post office controlled radio at first, and then they imposed a device tax. So every time you had and it's still like a massive controversy that they're trying to phase out the device tax now in Great Britain finally. But the more radios you had and televisions, the more you were supposed to pay into this central slush fund, and that created the BBC and funded the BBC. And there just wasn't a lot of competition, but state broadcasters in Europe as well had this model. And in the United States, people were like, we don't do state broadcasting, but you can't have advertising. That was what they used to say. And you can't, like, I don't know. It just didn't make any sense. And they were just like, it'll be fine.
Oh my
Um,
God. It's
yeah.
so triggering.
So seeing that pattern 100 years ago, I was like, oh, that explains so much. Okay, now I get it.
But Julia,
So I just
that's
wanted
the
to share that
but Julia,
with the
that's the thing
people.
that's so amazing. It's that you see how little has actually changed. Where,
Yep.
you see an industry where people say, "Well, wait a minute, like we're in trouble. Something's going on. How are we going to solve this?" And let's throw out ideas. Let's try to, and then you throw out the ideas, you get them, and you look. Well, let's just take a second and think for a minute here. Is this really
hmm
what we want to do? And I mean, listen, I could say for myself, being parts of, of places where that, you see where people are looking for something innovative. What do we get? And then all of a sudden, there's almost like a hesitation of, are we going to change to, what is this really going to do? And I understand,
hmm
the thing is, I think once we see an industry like what we're all in right now, where it seems, and it's all of media, um,
hmm
I guess just seeing the repetitiveness of it all, like what what is it that we can look at looking forward? What lessons can we learn that happened from this situation? Um, what are things that if we were to look at today, listen, everyone,
Hmm.
what's something that we should be learning from from this time period and taking forward, and maybe things that we should be changing of how we look at this?
Yeah, I mean, that's a big question. And like a lot of people are jumping in now in terms of, the death of local media, the struggles of public broadcasting in the United States, which by the way was not part of the conversation, although people were trying to build public media from the beginning. But it didn't really happen until the 60s. I think it's just sort of like there's no one miracle cure. And it's also just being more wary about the instability in general of the whole system. So, yes, you can have, more entry points if you have an unstable system, right? Like people can jump in and try things, but how long will those efforts last realistically, given the overall instability of the situation? Even something like cable TV, which really did solve for all of these problems, right? Like, not only did it have a subscriber base of people who paid kind of a lot of money to get stuff, but it also had ads on it. Like, they got everything they wanted with cable TV, broadcasters did. And yet it still couldn't last. So, people are cutting the cord, cable is dying, blah, blah, blah. So I just think like the romantic nature of Americans thinking innovation is the answer. It's like, I guess, but if you're working in the industry, maybe if you're an investor, but if you're working in the industry and you're trying to have a stable career, it's maybe not the place to go for stability. I
It's
don't
funny
know.
because
I don't know what the answers are, but I do think it has to get really bad in America for people to change the calculus. And I know some people, Ralph Nader's trying, like people, foundations are trying. At least people are recognizing the problem, and it's all intertwined. Like all of these problems that were radio's problems 100 years ago are now all of media's problems. Because basically, with the internet, media adopted the give it away for free model pretty much wholeheartedly. And now that's all of our problems. And now people are realizing like that doesn't work. So maybe it's good that it got so bad and so
hmm
widespread.
hmm
It'll be good for maybe like grandchildren of ours, but not for us
Well,
right
I,
now.
I even look at streaming models, that became the
Mm-hmm.
thing. When that became the answer, it was like Netflix and no commercials, and you have all this control. And then all of a sudden, I remember when Netflix was like, we're never going to do ad supported, content. And of course, now there's ad supported content because they sort of, everybody, that's the thing. It's like people push off, and it just seems like this whole free thing, it's so difficult to get past for listeners, viewers, to get past the
Mm-hmm.
notion of having to really pay for content. Especially, I think it's one thing when you talk about, especially talk about journalism or you're talking about
Yeah.
podcasting, it's so easy to just think, I want it for free.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's the thing. And so that's why other countries chose other models where they just tax it at the device level, right?
Yeah.
And even like there was a little line item in cable bills to pay for public, access TV, but that had to be legislated.
Mm.
So it's hairy. But I do think, I mean, in terms of people in the business, there's some consolation in knowing that this is not your fault, that this world is unstable. And you can kind of go in with your eyes open, like, oh, I'm joining an unstable business because I am passionate about communication. And I'm just gonna see what happens, like see how long I can last, as opposed to being like, oh, I'm gonna believe everything my hiring manager tells me about how great my job is gonna be and how, I'm gonna have this 401k, and then being like bitter and angry 2 years later when you're laid off, and also feeling like it's your fault and there was something you could have done. So in a way, I find maybe some consolation in studying history because, you know, this instability, there were a lot of great people who came into radio, who maybe couldn't have broken into newspaper publishing or some other, or written books. And they found, they created new forms with it. So it was exciting and great. But then when television came along, they were all kind of tossed aside or, forced to go into a medium that they maybe didn't love as much. And radio was neglected. So I don't know. I see a lot of role models in terms of how to think and also the possibilities of what will happen if you choose a career in this business. And for me, maybe just because I'm older and I've been through, multiple layoffs, I'm like, okay, so I'm in this business. I'm not leaving. This is what I love, but there's a cost to doing what you love, and I'm paying it with my life and my children's future too. And people did that before, and that's just how it is. I know that's a little fatalistic. I do
But
support,
it's real.
ideas. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's real on the individual level, and then on the macro level, it's like, yeah, maybe we should be paying, some sort of power processing power tax on our devices. So like the more power fancy iPhone you have, the more you pay towards a central slush fund to support public media. I don't know. That's just like pie in the sky stuff, but like, why aren't we talking about this? We tried one model for 100 years, give it away for free, hope that advertising and subscribers and I don't know what, Kickstarter,
Hmm.
I'm sorry,
like
that's just hilarious.
begging.
So we tried this idea to just give it away for free. We tried it, we gave it a
Yeah.
century, it didn't work out.
Yeah, it's not working out so great right now. I mean, I think it did work out. It made people a lot of
Yeah,
money, and
that's
that was
true.
part
Like
of
I
the.
think if you caught on like what
Mhm.
mid-century into I'd say at least the last like 20, 30 years, that was a great
Yeah,
time to be doing it.
it was good times for the networks.
Yeah.
I think the local stations were always struggling. Public media has always been struggling. Kind of, I think that's built into the system. Like we don't want it to be too effective, sadly. But yeah, for networks and especially cable TV providers getting money from like all angles. Yeah, it worked out. It's unstable. And now people, it's the people in the business who pay the price, and there's so much talent just like sitting around being underutilized, and it's just hard to see. It's just depressing.
Well, I wouldn't say that your suggestions are completely like pie in the sky or out there because actually last season, we spoke with Professor Victor Picard, who's a
Mm-hmm.
media and Okay, so you're familiar with him. He
Yeah, he's
came onto
great.
my radar, yeah, because of his. I believe he said that journalism and capitalism was always a match made in hell, and I initially was just like, oh, I have to talk to that dude. But then
Yeah.
after that, when we were speaking with him he actually had this quote. I'm going to insert the quote, but what he said was any kind of systemic fix to this problem is going to involve massive public subsidies. We just have to make sure it's from the ground up. He's talking about the government making subsidies into broadcasting. Anyway, so he admits that his ideas can come across as radical or utopian, but I'm hearing more and more people start to say, like, actually, no, we do have to think outside what has been the traditional box, and maybe this is
Mm-hmm.
something that could work. Do you
Yeah.
think that government set like it's kind of like the model of the BBC or something like that, that could be something that helps shore it up? Because one thing that has been very clear is that without strong journalism, and especially at the local level, that undermines democracy. And there's so much false information and manipulation, et cetera, flooding the market. And especially now as AI is about to
Mm-hmm.
just take off and fly away, maybe somebody should grab that kite string before it completely takes off.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, and it's also the sad thing is like all the stuff that's not being reported on the local levels, right? And then you see a disaster like some of the people running for public office, like kind of belatedly, or they're in public office, and then finally, someone in the national press pays attention to them because they're in the swing state, or they're
Or from
particularly
Long
saying
Island.
insane things. Yeah, they're saying insane things, and then finally they get the media attention that they should have gotten when they were first campaigning, but there kind of wasn't, you know, that the local press has been so eviscerated by this unstable profit, extraction model of journalism, coupled with the advertising market kind of cratering and all the disruptions of tech and blah blah blah. And so the consequences are severe, and it's more than just mis and disinformation, which we can kind of identify. It's lack of information. I'm editing Pushkin podcast's Against the Rules series with Michael Lewis, and this season we're reporting on sports gambling and the rise of internet, sports addictions and all of these things and all the consequences of it. And that is a story that's, it's getting more attention. But when it was first being legalized in all of these states after a Supreme Court decision in 2018, there were lobbyists in place that were working with our fantasy sports companies. And then they were, going back to the state capitals where they had been lobbying and then convincing legislators to legalize gambling in states. So there's about, I think, 23 states currently that have legalized sports gambling, and they advertise all the time. Anyway, one of the things that was sad to hear, but also I know it's true, is that there were no other media except for like the New York Times happened to pick a couple of state capitals to watch this effort unfold. There were no journalists watching while the legislators kind of like agreed with the the fantasy sports companies that wanted to get into gambling full time. They just gave them everything they wanted, and there were no watchdogs there to really witness. So it's that lack of witnessing that is very depressing to me as a journalist. And you see it in authoritarian countries. They're just like, well, these pesky eyewitnesses need to go away. The people who run the countries where they've destroyed the media also don't know what's going on in their own countries because they have made it so hard to be a journalist. So we have a version of that that's like not as authoritarian, but the same consequences, which is like nobody's watching. Nobody's making a living watching what's happening in places where there need to be witnesses. So that's a dire situation you can get in with an unstable model for journalism. It's kind of the same consequences as authoritarianism. It's just a different way to get there, and that's bad. So I think finally,
I think we can agree that that's definitely bad. But
yeah.
there's more than one path to authoritarianism. My God.
Yeah.
So Julie,
yes.
Go ahead. Oh no, I was gonna say. So do you so should the contest be opened up again? I mean, is this something that we should be talking about again? And is that something that we should be opening up? Do you think?
Yeah, I mean, the question still is valid, right?
Yeah.
Oh, totally.
Who should be paying for broadcasting?
Do you
but you can take it. You can take it wider.
Do you? Oh, okay. How so?
Well, because now it's like who pays for the article that you're, reading on the New York Times? Who's paying for that little newsletter? Who's paying? Like, I get asked for money all the time now, and I feel like an asshole just like reading all these blogs because I'm like, I'm maxed out on the subscriptions, so everyone knows that feeling, right? And I don't want to create a Substack for that very reason, because I don't want to have to beg for money all the time when I know that my peer group doesn't have any, So I think everyone understands this problem. It's just the lack of imagination. So something like a contest can open up possibilities if you're just invited. I think the question is who will implement, and that's what has to be. Like, they didn't really have a plan to lobby for this solution. They didn't really seem to want a solution. And maybe that's just because, the medium was in its infancy and they just thought, like, why get in the way of all the greatness to come, Whereas I think in Europe, it was a very different conversation. They were just like, this is big. We need to be, as, the post office or whatever. We need to be
feel
in
like
charge
we
of
should
this.
take maybe e pluribus unum and put move fast and break things on the money.
Right? No.
That
Yeah,
seems
and the people
to be
who
the
are
vibe.
broken.
We'll figure it out later. We'll figure it out later.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, before we let you go, we ask all of our guests the same ending question, and that is, despite all of the challenges and the understanding that this is an unstable career path, why did you choose to be a journalist?
I just enjoy like a career that gives me excuses to figure things out that I don't understand. So I grew up in Dallas, Texas, and I was just going through all my files. I'm like trying to send them to archives because I'm not reporting so much from Dallas anymore. But the fact that I got to be a journalist and like understand all of these things that nobody talked about in the city, because it was very much a forward-looking city with like oh no, 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 let's not talk about the assassination. Like, let's not talk about slavery. Let's not talk about all these things. Like, that was a long time ago. I'm like, being a journalist kind of in the historian mode helped me process and understand the place where I grew up. So it's a way of saying like, no, stop. Like, let's talk about this stuff. And so I feel like this broadcasting story is like another one of those. It's like there's a mystery, this sort of like forgotten, half forgotten, just like bullshit story that we're asked to accept. And being a journalist gives you a chance to be like, I don't accept that. I know there's something more to this. So that's why I can't stop doing that. And I enjoy editing other people too. It's just like helping them, asking questions as they're, drafting their podcast scripts or their stories to be like, oh, this raises a question. Let's find out more, or like there's a question lying right here or an observation that we can bring to the front and help listeners like understand the world better. So I just enjoy that. I'm just pesky that way
No,
about
I love that.
the
I love
facts in the
that.
past. And like, I don't like things that just sit there and everybody's like, that's just how it's done. It's like, well, maybe there's a reason why it's done that way. And maybe that reason is also not a good one. So like, let's find out.
Cool. Well, Julia, we want to thank you so much. This has been a great conversation and very
Oh, thanks for
illuminating,
having me.
sobering as some of them are. But again, this has been like, it's not a new problem. I think, and sometimes in some of the stuff that, I've read, it frames the crisis that media finds itself in as something that's sort of new. And actually, no, this had been brewing for a century. So that's fun. Anyway, Julia, I look forward to reading more of your work. So thank you
Oh,
for
thank
joining
you.
us. Laid Off and Looking is an independent podcast conceived of and created by Jenna Flanagan and Dominic Camia. Music provided by Jay Cowett, research by Lori Ruthenbucker. Reach out to us anytime at laidofandlookingpod@gmail.com. New episodes drop every Friday at noon.